The day I turned 18, my parents handed me a garbage bag with my clothes and told me I had 2 hours to get out. 5 years later, I stood in their driveway holding the deed to their house, watching them pack their belongings into those same garbage bags. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Marcus Thompson, and this story begins in the small town of Millfield, Ohio, where I grew up in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street. The house wasn't much to look at: faded blue siding, a sagging front porch, and a yard that never quite stayed green, no matter how much my father watered it. But it was home, or at least I thought it was. My parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, were what you might call old-school strict. Robert worked at the local manufacturing plant for 23 years, coming home every evening with grease under his fingernails and complaints about his supervisor. Linda cleaned houses for wealthy families across town, spending her days scrubbing other people's toilets while dreaming of having something better for herself. Growing up, I learned early that nothing came free in the Thompson household. When I was 12, I wanted a bicycle for my birthday. Instead of buying one, Robert made me mow lawns for 3 months to earn the money myself. When I was 14 and asked for help with my science project, Linda told me that figuring things out on my own would make me stronger. Everything was a lesson about self-reliance, about not depending on anyone else, about earning your place in the world. I threw myself into my studies, partly because I genuinely loved learning, but mostly because I saw education as my ticket out of Millfield. While other kids were hanging out at the mall or playing video games, I was in the library researching colleges, scholarships, and anything that could help me build a different life. My grades were stellar. I graduated valedictorian with a 4.0 GPA and had already been accepted to Ohio State University with a partial academic scholarship. The problem started during my senior year when I began making plans for college. I assumed, perhaps naively, that my parents would be proud of my achievements and supportive of my educational goals. Instead, every conversation about college turned into an argument about money, responsibility, and what they called getting too big for my britches. "College is for rich kids," Robert would say, not looking up from his evening beer. "You think you're better than us now? Think you're too good for honest work?" Linda was more subtle, but equally discouraging. "Marcus, honey, you need to be realistic. College costs money we don't have, and there's no guarantee you'll even find a job afterward. Maybe you should consider the community college, or better yet, get a job at the plant like your father." I tried explaining about the scholarship, about how I'd already been accepted, about how this was my chance to create a better future. But every conversation felt like talking to a wall. They seemed to take my ambition as a personal insult, as if wanting more than what they had was somehow a rejection of them. The tension in the house became unbearable. Simple conversations turned into lectures about gratitude and knowing my place. When I brought home college brochures, they'd mysteriously disappear. When I tried to discuss financial aid options, they'd change the subject or find reasons to end the conversation. Things came to a head 3 weeks before my 18th birthday. I had been working part-time at Henderson's hardware store after school, saving every penny for college expenses. Mr. Henderson, the owner, was a kind man in his 60s who had taken an interest in my future. He offered to write me a recommendation letter and even suggested I could work summers at his store to help pay for school. When I told my parents about Mr. Henderson's offer, expecting them to be pleased, Robert exploded. "So now you're making plans behind our backs? Getting other people involved in family business? That old man is filling your head with ideas you can't afford." "He's trying to help me succeed," I protested. "Why can't you see that this is a good thing?" "Because you're 17 years old and you don't know anything about the real world," Linda snapped. "We've fed you, clothed you, and put a roof over your head for 18 years, and this is how you repay us? By running off to play college boy?" The argument that followed was unlike anything we'd ever had. Voices were raised, accusations flew, and things were said that couldn't be taken back. Robert accused me of being ungrateful and selfish. Linda cried and said I was abandoning the family. I, in my teenage frustration, said things about their lack of ambition and narrow-mindedness that I immediately regretted. The final straw came when I mentioned that I'd been talking to my guidance counselor about options for students from low-income families. The word low-income sent Robert into a rage. Low income? You think we're poor? You think we haven't provided for you? He stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. Maybe it's time you learned what poor really means. That night, I heard them talking in hushed, angry voices through the thin walls. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard phrases like disrespectful, thinks he's better than us, and needs to learn a lesson. The next morning at breakfast, the atmosphere was different, colder, more final. Robert barely looked at me, and Linda's eyes were red from crying. They'd made a decision, and I could feel it hanging in the air like a storm cloud. We've been talking, Linda said quietly, not meeting my eyes. And we think it's time you learned some independence. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Robert folded his newspaper with sharp, deliberate movements. You want to be an adult? You want to make your own decisions? Fine. On your 18th birthday, you can start supporting yourself. I stared at them, hoping this was some kind of bluff, some harsh lesson that would blow over. You're kicking me out? We're helping you become independent, Linda said, though her voice wavered. You clearly think you don't need us, so prove it. The next 2 weeks passed in a surreal haze. I went to school, worked at the hardware store, and came home to a house that felt like a hotel where I was no longer welcome. My parents spoke to me only when necessary, and even then their words were clipped and formal. I kept hoping they'd change their minds, that this was just their way of scaring me into giving up my college dreams. But as my birthday approached, reality set in. I started making quiet preparations, looking at cheap apartments, calculating how many hours I'd need to work to pay rent, trying to figure out how I could possibly afford college while supporting myself. Mr. Henderson, sensing something was wrong, gently asked if everything was okay at home. I was too embarrassed to tell him the truth. The night before my 18th birthday, I barely slept. I kept thinking they'd come to my room, sit on my bed, and tell me this had all been a test, that they were proud of me and wanted to help me succeed. But morning came with no such conversation. I came downstairs for breakfast to find a large garbage bag sitting by the front door with my name written on it in my mother's careful handwriting. Robert was already dressed for work, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and morning paper as if it were any ordinary day. Linda stood at the sink, her back turned to me, washing dishes that were already clean. Happy birthday, son, Robert said without looking up from the sports section. The word son felt hollow, like he was reading from a script. I stood there in my pajamas, staring at the garbage bag, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. You're really doing this. Linda's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. We talked about this, Marcus. You're 18 now. It's time. Where am I supposed to go? That's for you to figure out, Robert said, finally meeting my eyes. You're so smart, so independent. This should be easy for someone with your talents. I wanted to scream, to argue, to beg them to reconsider. Instead, I went upstairs and got dressed with shaking hands. I opened the garbage bag to find my clothes hastily stuffed inside, wrinkled, some still on hangers, others thrown in carelessly. At the bottom, I found my high school diploma, my college acceptance letter, and exactly $47 in cash. 2 hours later, I stood on the sidewalk in front of the only home I'd ever known, holding everything I owned in a torn garbage bag. Robert had already left for work. Linda watched from the living room window, her face pale and drawn, but she didn't come outside. My first night of independence was spent on a park bench 3 blocks away. I'd walked around town for hours, too proud to ask for help, too shocked to think clearly. Millfield wasn't big enough to have homeless shelters or youth services. The park bench was hard and cold, and every sound made me jump. I clutched my garbage bag like a lifeline and watched the sunrise paint the sky pink, wondering what I was going to do. The next morning, I showed up at Henderson's hardware store before it opened. Mr. Henderson took one look at me, disheveled, exhausted, carrying my belongings in a garbage bag, and didn't ask questions. He unlocked the door and led me to the small office in the back. Coffee? He asked simply. I nodded, afraid that if I spoke, I might break down completely. He poured 2 cups from an old coffee maker and sat across from me at his cluttered desk. You want to tell me what happened, or should I just assume your parents finally lost their minds? The kindness in his voice was my undoing. The whole story came pouring out. The arguments, the ultimatum, the garbage bag. Mr. Henderson listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking his head or muttering under his breath. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. Well, he said finally, I've got a storage room upstairs that's been collecting dust for years. It's not much, just a cot, a hot plate, and a small bathroom. But it's warm and dry, and it's yours if you want it. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I nearly cried with relief. Mr. Henderson, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. Consider it part of your employment package. You can work full-time now that school's out, and I'll pay you $15 an hour. That should be enough to cover basic expenses and maybe save a little for college. That storage room became my sanctuary. It was barely bigger than a closet, with one small window that looked out over Main Street. The cot was narrow and lumpy, the hot plate could barely heat a can of soup, and the bathroom was so small I had to step into the hallway to fully open the door. But it was mine, and Mr. Henderson never made me feel like a charity case. Working full-time at the hardware store was both a blessing and a challenge. The physical work was demanding, unloading trucks, organizing inventory, helping customers with heavy purchases. But I learned valuable skills: basic carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, and most importantly, how to solve problems with whatever resources were available. Mr. Henderson became more than an employer. He became a mentor. During slow afternoons, he'd teach me about business, how to read financial statements, understand profit margins, negotiate with suppliers. He'd worked his way up from nothing, starting as a stock boy and eventually buying the store from the previous owner. Success isn't about where you start, he'd tell me while we organized paint cans or counted screws. It's about how willing you are to learn and how hard you're willing to work when nobody's watching. I threw myself into the job with desperate intensity. I arrived early, stayed late, and volunteered for every unpleasant task. When the store's ancient inventory system crashed, I taught myself basic computer programming to create a simple replacement. When a customer needed a custom shelving unit, I designed and built it myself using skills I'd picked up watching YouTube videos late at night. The hardest part wasn't the work or the cramped living conditions, it was the silence from my parents. I'd walk past our house every day on my way to the store, hoping to catch a glimpse of them, hoping they'd call out to me or show some sign that they missed me. But the house remained closed to me, its windows like blind eyes that refused to acknowledge my existence. 3 months after my birthday, I ran into Mrs. Patterson, our next-door neighbor, at the grocery store. She'd always been kind to me, often bringing over cookies or letting me help with her garden when I was younger. "Marcus," she said, her face lighting up. "How are you, honey? Your parents said you went away to college." The lie hit me like a physical blow. They were telling people I'd left for college, painting themselves as proud parents, sending their son off to higher education. Meanwhile, I was living above a hardware store, wearing the same 3 shirts in rotation. "Something like that," I managed to say. Mrs. Patterson chatted for a few more minutes about how proud they must be, how exciting it was for me to be starting my adult life. Each word twisted the knife deeper. When she finally walked away, I stood in the cereal aisle fighting back tears. That night, lying on my narrow cot, I made a decision that would change everything. If my parents wanted to pretend I was away at college, then I'd make that lie become truth. But I wouldn't do it their way, begging for scraps and approval. I'd do it my way, and I'd show them exactly what they'd thrown away. I started taking online courses through the local community college, using the store's computer after hours. Mr. Henderson didn't mind. He said it was good to see someone using the machine for something other than solitaire. I studied business administration, accounting, and economics, often working on assignments until well past midnight. During my lunch breaks, I'd walk through different neighborhoods in town, studying the houses, noting which ones were well maintained and which ones were falling apart. I started reading real estate listings, learning about property values, mortgage rates, and investment opportunities. It became an obsession, understanding how money moved, how wealth was built, how power shifted from those who spent to those who owned. 6 months after being kicked out, I'd saved nearly $3,000. It wasn't much, but it was more money than I'd ever had in my life. More importantly, I'd discovered something about myself. I was good with money. While other kids my age were spending their paychecks on cars and clothes, I found satisfaction in watching my bank balance grow. Mr. Henderson noticed my dedication and offered me a partnership opportunity. He was getting older and needed someone to help modernize the business. He proposed that I could buy into the store gradually, learning the ins and outs of ownership while building equity. "You've got good instincts, Marcus," he told me one evening as we locked up the store. "Better than most people twice your age. You see problems as opportunities, and that's a rare gift." That night, I walked past my childhood home one more time. The house looked exactly the same. Same faded siding, same sagging porch, same brown spots in the lawn. But I saw it differently now. I saw it as my parents saw it. A burden, a symbol of limitation, a place where dreams went to die. I also saw something else, an opportunity waiting to be seized. The partnership with Mr. Henderson transformed my life in ways I never expected. Within a year, I'd bought a 20% stake in Henderson's Hardware, using my savings and a small business loan that Mr. Henderson co-signed. The paperwork made it official. I wasn't just an employee anymore, I was a business owner. My first major decision as a partner was to expand our services. I'd noticed that many customers came in asking for help with home repairs they couldn't do themselves. While Mr. Henderson would politely refer them to contractors, I saw dollar signs. Why send business elsewhere when we could capture it ourselves? I started offering handyman services on weekends, using skills I developed working at the store. My first client was Mrs. Rodriguez, who needed her kitchen cabinets repaired after a water leak. The job took me 6 hours and earned me $200. More importantly, she was so pleased with the work that she recommended me to 3 of her neighbors. Word spread quickly in a small town like Millfield. Soon I was booking repair jobs every weekend, then extending into weekday evenings. I hired Jake Morrison, a recent high school graduate who was handy with tools, to help with the larger projects. Within 6 months, the repair service was generating more profit than the retail side of the hardware store. Mr. Henderson watched my expansion with a mixture of pride and amazement. "You've got the entrepreneurial bug," he told me one evening as we reviewed the month's financial statements. "I ran this place the same way for 30 years, never thinking to grow beyond these 4 walls. You've doubled our revenue in 18 months. But success brought unexpected challenges. The more visible I became in town, the more likely I was to encounter people from my past. I developed a routine of avoiding certain streets and shopping at specific times to minimize the chance of running into my parents. However, in a town of 8,000 people, complete avoidance was impossible. The encounter happened on a Tuesday afternoon at Peterson's grocery store. I was picking up supplies for a kitchen renovation job when I turned the corner in the produce section and came face to face with Linda. She was holding a bag of apples, her hair now streaked with gray I didn't remember, her clothes worn but clean. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she set down the apples and took a step toward me. "Marcus," she said softly, "you look different." I was different. 2 years of physical labor had built muscle on my previously skinny frame. I wore work clothes that fit properly, not the hand-me-downs and thrift store finds of my teenage years. My truck, parked outside, was a used Ford F-150 that I'd bought in cash 6 months earlier. "Hello, Linda," I said, deliberately using her first name instead of Mom. She flinched at the formality. "How have you been? We heard you were doing well." The "we" stung. They'd been keeping tabs on me while maintaining their silence. "I'm managing." "I know you're working at Henderson's. And I heard you're doing repairs around town." She twisted her hands nervously. That's good. You always were handy with tools." An awkward silence stretched between us. Part of me wanted to tell her about the business partnership, about the money I was making, about the online courses I'd completed. Part of me wanted to ask why they'd never reached out, never apologized, never acknowledged that maybe they'd been wrong. Instead, I just nodded. I should go. I have a job to get to. As I walked away, I heard her call my name, but I didn't turn around. That night, I lay awake thinking about the encounter, about the pain in her eyes, about the gray in her hair. But I also thought about the garbage bag, about the park bench, about being 19 years old and homeless, because my parents couldn't handle my ambition. The encounter motivated me to push harder. I started looking beyond Millfield for opportunities, driving to neighboring towns to bid on larger renovation projects. I hired 2 more employees and bought better equipment. By my 20th birthday, Thompson Home Services, I'd officially incorporated the repair business, was handling everything from bathroom renovations to small commercial projects. Mr. Henderson, now in his 70s, began talking about retirement. I never had kids, he told me one day as we watched Jake and the crew unload a shipment of lumber. This business was my baby. But watching you grow it, seeing what you've built, it's like watching your child become more successful than you ever dreamed of being. He offered to sell me his remaining 80% of the hardware store for a price that was more than fair. The loan required most of my savings and a substantial monthly payment, but at 21, I became the sole owner of Henderson's Hardware and Thompson Home Services. The day I signed the papers, I drove past my childhood home. Robert was in the front yard, struggling to fix a broken gate latch. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was fighting with a simple repair that I could have completed in 5 minutes. But more than that, I noticed things I hadn't seen before. The house needed new gutters. The roof had several missing shingles. The front steps were sagging. The foundation showed signs of settling. For the first time, I didn't see my childhood home as a symbol of my rejection. I saw it as a business opportunity. I started researching the property quietly. Through public records, I learned that my parents had taken out a second mortgage 3 years earlier. Their monthly payments were higher than I'd expected, especially considering Robert's factory wages and Linda's cleaning income. The house was worth less than they owed on it. They were underwater on their mortgage. I also discovered something interesting. The factory where Robert worked was struggling. Automation had eliminated several positions, and rumors circulated about potential layoffs or even plant closure. If Robert lost his job, my parents would be in serious financial trouble. The idea started as a passing thought, then grew into an obsession. What if I could buy their house? Not to hurt them, but to prove a point. To show them that the son they'd thrown away had become successful beyond their imagination. I spent weeks running numbers, exploring financing options, and researching comparable properties. The house would need significant renovations to be profitable as a rental property, but I had the skills and crew to do the work. More importantly, I had something my parents didn't: steady income, good credit, and cash reserves. The plan crystallized over several sleepless nights. I would wait for the right moment, when they were financially vulnerable, and make an offer they couldn't refuse. Not out of cruelty, but out of justice. They'd taught me that everything had to be earned, that nothing came free, that independence was the highest virtue. Now I would teach them the same lesson. 6 months later, the opportunity presented itself. The factory announced layoffs, and Robert's name was on the list. I heard about it through Jake, whose uncle worked at the plant. Within a week, I'd positioned myself to make the move that would change everything. The boy they'd kicked out with a garbage bag was about to become their landlord. The factory layoffs created a ripple effect throughout Millfield that I watched with calculated interest. Robert wasn't the only one affected. 37 workers lost their jobs in a single day, and most of them had been with the company for over a decade. These were men and women with mortgages, car payments, and families to support, suddenly facing an uncertain future in a town where good-paying jobs were scarce. I learned about Robert's situation through careful observation rather than direct inquiry. Jake's uncle, Tommy Morrison, had worked alongside my father for 15 years before the layoffs. During our lunch breaks, Tommy would stop by the hardware store to chat with Jake, and their conversations provided valuable intelligence. "Your dad's taking it hard," Tommy told Jake one afternoon while I pretended to organize inventory nearby. 23 years at that place, and they cut him loose with 2 weeks severance. Linda's picking up extra cleaning jobs, but it's not nearly enough to cover their expenses. I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing this news. Part of me, the part that still remembered being a scared 18-year-old with nowhere to go, felt satisfied that they were experiencing financial stress. But another part, the part that remembered Robert teaching me to ride a bike and Linda packing my school lunches, felt genuinely sorry for their situation. However, sympathy wouldn't change my plans. If anything, their financial vulnerability made my strategy more viable. I began preparing for my move by strengthening my own financial position. Thompson Home Services had grown beyond my expectations, and I'd recently secured contracts for 2 major commercial renovations that would keep my crew busy through the end of the year. The hardware store was generating steady profits, and I'd even opened a second location in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. My accountant, Sarah Chen, was a sharp woman in her 30s who'd helped me navigate the complexities of business expansion. During our quarterly review, she raised an eyebrow at my cash reserves. "You're sitting on almost $60,000 in liquid assets," she noted, reviewing my financial statements. "That's impressive for someone your age, but it's also a lot of money earning minimal interest in savings accounts. Have you considered real estate investments?" "Actually, I have a specific property in mind," I told her. I explained my situation carefully, omitting the personal details but outlining the business opportunity. A distressed property in need of renovation, owners facing financial difficulties, potential for both rental income and long-term appreciation. Sarah ran the numbers and confirmed what I already knew. It was a solid investment from a purely financial perspective. With your renovation skills, you could probably increase the property value by 20 to 30% within the first year, she said. Just make sure you're making this decision with your head, not your heart. If only she knew how much my heart was involved. The next step was gathering specific information about my parents' financial situation. This required delicate maneuvering, as I couldn't appear too interested without arousing suspicion. I started by checking public records at the courthouse, which revealed the details of their mortgage, property taxes, and any liens against the property. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd expected. Not only were they underwater on their primary mortgage, but they'd also taken out a home equity loan the previous year. Between the 2 loans, they owed nearly $40,000 more than the house was worth in its current condition. Their monthly obligations were crushing. Between the mortgage payments, the equity loan, utilities, insurance, and basic living expenses, they needed at least $3,200 per month just to stay afloat. With Robert unemployed and Linda's cleaning income averaging around $800 monthly, they were falling deeper into debt every day. I also discovered that they'd already missed 2 mortgage payments. The bank had sent formal notices, and they were dangerously close to foreclosure proceedings. This information came from a source I hadn't expected, Jennifer Walsh, a loan officer at First National Bank who'd gone to high school with me. I'd run into Jennifer at a Chamber of Commerce networking event, where I'd been invited as one of the town's young entrepreneurs. We'd talked about business, and she'd mentioned how difficult it was watching longtime community members struggle with foreclosures. "It's heartbreaking," she said over coffee after the event. "Good people who've lived in this town their whole lives, losing their homes because of circumstances beyond their control. We try to work with them, but sometimes the numbers just don't add up." I asked general questions about the foreclosure process, positioning myself as someone interested in potentially purchasing distressed properties as investments. Jennifer explained the timeline, how banks typically preferred to avoid foreclosure because it was expensive and time-consuming, how they often welcomed cash offers from investors even at below-market prices. "The key is timing," she explained. "Approach the bank after the homeowners have missed several payments but before the foreclosure process becomes irreversible. Make a fair offer that covers the outstanding debt, and everyone can walk away without completely destroying their credit." The conversation gave me the framework I needed. I wasn't planning to swoop in and steal my parents' house. I was planning to save them from foreclosure while achieving my own goals. Over the next month, I quietly assembled everything I'd need to make an offer. I had my financing pre-approved, got a professional property appraisal conducted discreetly, and even had renovation estimates prepared for the work the house would need. The final piece of information came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd unknowingly revealed my parents' lie about college, approached me at the grocery store one evening. "Marcus, honey," she said, looking worried, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are your parents okay? I've noticed they seem stressed lately." and your mother mentioned they might need to sell the house. My heart rate quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. Oh? I hadn't heard anything about that. Well, maybe I shouldn't have said anything, Mrs. Patterson continued, clearly uncomfortable. It's just that your father's been out of work, and I know things must be tight. Such a shame. They've lived in that house for so long. That night, I sat in my apartment above the hardware store, staring at the financial projections Sarah had prepared. The numbers were clear. I could purchase my parents' house for enough money to pay off their debts and give them a small amount to start over somewhere else. They'd avoid foreclosure, protect their credit, and walk away with their dignity intact. And I would own the house where I'd grown up, the house they'd kicked me out of with nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes. The irony was perfect, but the reality was more complex than I'd anticipated. Purchasing the house would accomplish my goal of proving my success, but it would also force a direct confrontation with my parents. There would be no hiding my prosperity, no maintaining the fiction that we were simply estranged family members living separate lives. I would have to look them in the eye and reveal that their rejected son had become successful enough to buy their home out from under them. The thought should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt heavy with the weight of finality. Once I made this move, there would be no going back. Whatever relationship we might have salvaged would be permanently altered. But as I looked around my small apartment, comfortable but modest, a far cry from the home I dreamed of having by this age, I realized that ship had already sailed. They'd made their choice 3 years ago, when they'd handed me that garbage bag. Now it was time for me to make mine. I picked up the phone to call Jennifer Walsh and schedule a meeting with the bank. The meeting with Jennifer Walsh at First National Bank took place on a gray Thursday morning in late October. I arrived at the bank 15 minutes early, wearing my best suit, a navy blue outfit I'd purchased specifically for important business meetings. The transformation from the teenager who'd been kicked out in pajamas wasn't lost on me as I sat in the polished lobby, reviewing my prepared documents. Jennifer greeted me with professional warmth, leading me to a small conference room where she'd already laid out files and calculators. Before we begin, she said, settling into her chair, I want to make sure you understand that what we're discussing is completely confidential. The bank has strict policies about client privacy. Quote, I nodded, though we both knew that confidentiality was somewhat meaningless in a town the size of Millfield. I appreciate that, Jennifer. I want to handle this situation as professionally and discreetly as possible. She opened a thick folder containing documents I recognized, mortgage statements, payment histories, and correspondence that painted a clear picture of my parents' deteriorating financial situation. The Thompson property on Maple Street, she began, consulting her notes. The borrowers are currently 4 months behind on their primary mortgage and 3 months behind on their home equity loan. Total outstanding debt is approximately $112,000. The number hit me harder than expected. My parents owed more than I'd estimated, which meant they were in even deeper trouble than I'd realized. The property was appraised at $78,000 in its current condition, Jennifer continued. However, that appraisal is 6 months old, and property values in this area have continued to decline since the factory layoffs. I pulled out my own appraisal, conducted just 2 weeks earlier by an independent company from Cedar Falls. I had a recent assessment done, I said, sliding the document across the table. $72,000, assuming no major structural issues. Jennifer reviewed the numbers with practiced efficiency. So we're looking at a property that's underwater by approximately $40,000, with borrowers who haven't made a payment in months and have no realistic prospect of catching up on their arrears. What are the bank's options at this point? Foreclosure, she said simply. We've already initiated the process, though we're hoping to avoid completing it. Foreclosures are expensive for everyone involved. Legal fees, property maintenance, marketing costs. We typically recover less than 60 cents on the dollar when we're forced to sell through foreclosure. This was the opening I'd been waiting for. What if you had a cash buyer willing to purchase the property at fair market value and assume responsibility for all outstanding debts? Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly. You're talking about a short sale scenario. The bank would need to write off the difference between what's owed and what the property sells for, but we'd avoid the foreclosure costs and get the loan off our books immediately. Quote, I opened my briefcase and withdrew a folder containing my financial statements, bank letters confirming my available cash, and a preliminary purchase offer. I'm prepared to offer $75,000 cash, closing within 30 days. She studied the documents carefully, occasionally making notes or consulting her calculator. After several minutes of silence, she looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. This is a very strong offer, Marcus. The bank would actually recover more money than we'd expect from a foreclosure sale. She paused, tapping her pen against the table. I have to ask, do you have any personal connection to this property? The question hung in the air between us. I could have lied, could have maintained the fiction that this was purely a business transaction. Instead, I chose honesty. Robert and Linda Thompson are my parents, I said quietly. They kicked me out of that house when I turned 18. I haven't spoken to them since I ran into my mother at the grocery store last year. Jennifer set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. Oh, Marcus, I had no idea. This puts things in a very different light. Does it change anything from a business perspective? No, she said after a moment. Your offer is legitimate, your financing is solid, and the bank has a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders to recover as much of the loan as possible. But as someone who's known your family for years, I have to ask, are you sure this is what you want to do? The question forced me to confront the reality of my decision. Once I purchased the house, there would be no pretending this was just business. My parents would know that their son, the one they deemed ungrateful and irresponsible, had become successful enough to buy their home. They taught me that everything has to be earned, I said finally, that nothing comes free, and that independence is the most important thing. I'm just applying the lessons they taught me. Jennifer nodded slowly. I'll need to present this to the loan committee, but I don't anticipate any problems. Your offer is fair, and it solves a significant problem for the bank. How do you want to handle notification of the borrowers? This was the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading. I'd like to be present when they're informed of the sale. That's unusual, Jennifer said carefully. Typically, we handle that communication directly with the borrowers. I understand. But given the family situation, I think it would be better if I could explain the circumstances personally. She agreed to arrange a meeting for the following week, pending approval from the loan committee. As I left the bank, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread. The plan I'd been developing for months was finally in motion, but the reality of confronting my parents felt more daunting than I'd expected. The loan committee approved my offer within 3 days. Jennifer called to confirm that everything was moving forward and scheduled a meeting with my parents for the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. She would present the situation as a potential solution to their foreclosure problem, with a buyer willing to purchase the property quickly and at a fair price. She wouldn't reveal my identity until I arrived. I spent the weekend in a state of nervous energy, alternating between confidence and doubt. Part of me wondered if I should call off the whole thing, find some way to help my parents without the dramatic confrontation. But another part, the part that still remembered the humiliation of being homeless at 18, pushed me forward. On Monday evening, I drove past the house one final time before the meeting. The property looked even more rundown than I remembered. The gutters were pulling away from the roofline, several shutters hung crooked, and the front lawn was brown and patchy. It struck me that my parents had been struggling for longer than I'd realized, probably even before Robert lost his job. The next morning, I put on my best suit again and reviewed my talking points. I wanted to be clear about my intentions. This wasn't revenge, it was business. I was offering them a way out of their financial crisis while pursuing a legitimate investment opportunity. At least, that's what I told myself as I drove to the bank for the meeting that would change everything. The receptionist directed me to the same conference room where I'd met with Jennifer the previous week. She was already there, along with 2 people I hadn't seen up close in over 3 years. Robert looked older, his hair completely gray now, his face lined with worry. Linda appeared smaller somehow, as if the stress had physically diminished her. They sat close together on one side of the table, holding hands like people bracing for bad news. They looked up when I entered the room, and the expression that crossed their faces was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Shock, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "Hello, Robert. Linda," I said, taking the seat across from them. "I think we need to talk." The silence in the conference room stretched for what felt like an eternity. Robert's hand tightened around Linda's, his knuckles going white. Linda's eyes filled with tears that she seemed determined not to let fall. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly regretting her decision to allow this unconventional arrangement. "I don't understand," Linda finally whispered. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" I folded my hands on the table, maintaining eye contact with both of them. "I'm here because I'm the buyer Jennifer mentioned. I'm purchasing your house." Robert's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, anger. "That's impossible. You're just a kid working at a hardware store." "I own the hardware store," I corrected quietly. "I also own Thompson Home Services, a renovation company with 12 employees. I have the cash to purchase your house and pay off all your outstanding debts." Jennifer cleared her throat nervously. "Perhaps I should explain the financial details," she said, opening her folder. "Mr. Thompson, Marcus, has made an offer of $75,000 cash. This would be enough to satisfy both your primary mortgage and your home equity loan, with approximately $3,000 remaining that would go to you." Linda's hands were shaking now. "Marcus, how did I go from sleeping on park benches to owning businesses?" I asked. "Hard work. The same hard work you told me I needed to learn when you kicked me out." Robert leaned forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "So this is what? Some kind of revenge? You want to humiliate us?" "No," I said, and I meant it. "This is business. You're facing foreclosure. The bank is going to take your house anyway, and you'll walk away with nothing and ruined credit. My offer lets you avoid foreclosure, pay off your debts, and start over somewhere else." "Start over?" Linda's voice cracked. "Marcus, this is our home. We've lived here for 25 years. You were born in the bedroom upstairs." The mention of my birth in that house hit me harder than I'd expected. For a moment, I saw flashes of memories. Linda reading me bedtime stories, Robert teaching me to throw a baseball in the backyard, family dinners around the kitchen table. But then I remembered the garbage bag, the cold night on the park bench, the months of silence. "You made it clear 3 years ago that it wasn't my home," I said evenly. "You told me I needed to learn independence. Well, I learned. I learned that everything has a price, that nothing is guaranteed, and that the people you trust most can abandon you when it's convenient." Jennifer attempted to mediate. "Perhaps we could discuss the logistics of the transition. If the sale goes through, you'd have 30 days to vacate the property. That should give you time to find alternative housing." 30 days? Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. 30 days to find a new place to live? We don't have money for deposits, first month's rent, moving expenses. Hell, we don't even have jobs. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out an envelope I'd prepared. The $3,000 from the sale should cover immediate expenses. I've also prepared a list of rental properties in the area that would be within your budget range, assuming you find employment. Linda stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. "You've really thought this through, haven't you? Down to the last detail." "I learned to plan ahead. Another lesson you taught me." "Don't you dare," Robert snapped. "Don't you dare blame us for this. We did our best raising you. We provided for you, gave you a roof over your head, food on the table. And this is how you repay us?" The hypocrisy of his words ignited something in me that I'd been keeping carefully controlled. "Repay you? You threw me out on my 18th birthday with a garbage bag and $47. I was homeless, Robert. I slept on a park bench because I had nowhere else to go." "You had choices," he shot back. "You could have given up that college nonsense, gotten a real job, and contributed to the household. Instead, you acted like you were better than us. I wanted an education. I wanted to build something better than what we had. How is that a crime?" Linda wiped her eyes with a tissue. "Marcus, honey, we were scared. Scared of losing you to a world we didn't understand. College, careers, all those things you talked about. They felt like you were rejecting everything we'd worked for." "So you rejected me first," I said. "You made sure I couldn't leave by choice. You forced me out so you could tell yourselves it was my decision." The room fell silent again. Jennifer was staring at her hands, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Robert sat back down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. "What happens now?" Linda asked quietly. Jennifer answered when I didn't immediately respond. If you accept the offer, we can close within 2 weeks. The sale would satisfy all your outstanding debts with the bank, and you'd receive the remaining $3,000 at closing. And if we don't accept? The foreclosure process continues. You'd likely have to vacate within 60 to 90 days anyway, and you'd receive nothing. Robert rubbed his face with his hands. Some choice. Get kicked out by our son or get kicked out by the bank. There's a difference, I said. The bank doesn't care what happens to you after foreclosure. I'm offering you enough money to start over and time to plan your next move. Why? Linda asked. If this is just business, why give us anything? Why not just buy the house from the bank after foreclosure? It was a fair question, and one I'd wrestled with myself. Because despite everything that's happened, I don't want to see you homeless. I know what that feels like. Robert looked up at me with something that might have been recognition. You really were homeless, weren't you, after you left? For the first night, yes. Then Mr. Henderson gave me a place to stay above the store. He became more of a father to me in 6 months than you'd been in 18 years. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Linda's tears started flowing freely now, and Robert's shoulders sagged as if he'd been carrying a weight that had suddenly become unbearable. We made mistakes, Linda whispered. We were so afraid of losing you that we pushed you away. But Marcus, we never stopped loving you. Even when we were angry, even when we were stubborn and proud, we never stopped loving you. For a moment, I felt the walls I'd built around my heart begin to crack. Part of me wanted to reach across the table, to find some way to bridge the gap that had grown between us. But then I remembered the years of silence, the pretending I didn't exist, the lie they'd told neighbors about me being away at college. Love isn't enough, I said finally. Love doesn't pay rent or put food on the table. You taught me that actions matter more than words. This is my action. I stood up and gathered my documents. Jennifer will handle the paperwork. You have until Friday to decide whether to accept the offer. As I reached the door, Linda called out to me. Marcus, wait, will we ever see you again? I turned back to look at them one last time. My parents, sitting in a bank conference room, about to lose their home to their own son. They looked smaller than I remembered, older and more fragile. For just a moment, I saw them not as the people who had hurt me, but as two frightened individuals who had made terrible decisions and were now facing the consequences. I don't know, I said honestly, but you have my number if you need anything during the transition. I walked out of the bank into the crisp autumn air, feeling neither triumphant nor vindicated. Instead, I felt empty, as if I'd just finished a race I wasn't sure I'd wanted to win. My parents accepted the offer on Thursday afternoon. Jennifer called to inform me that they'd signed all the necessary paperwork and that closing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the underlying tension. The entire transaction had been professionally handled, yet everyone involved knew this was far from a typical real estate deal. The weekend before closing passed in a strange haze. I found myself driving by the house multiple times, not out of nostalgia, but with the calculating eye of a property owner. I made mental notes about necessary repairs. The roof would need work before winter, the electrical system was probably outdated, and the plumbing in the upstairs bathroom had been problematic since my childhood. On Monday evening, I saw a moving truck parked in the driveway. Through the living room window, I could see cardboard boxes stacked against the walls and furniture covered in sheets. The sight should have felt like victory, but instead, it felt surreal. My parents were actually leaving. I parked across the street and watched for nearly an hour. Robert carried boxes to the truck with the methodical determination of a man completing an unpleasant but necessary task. Linda supervised the movers who were handling the larger furniture. Neither of them looked toward the street where I sat, though I wondered if they sensed my presence. The closing took place at Jennifer's office on Tuesday morning. My parents arrived separately from me, and we maintained a polite but distant professionalism throughout the process. The attorney handling the transaction was David Brennan, a man in his 60s who'd probably overseen thousands of property transfers, but seemed uncomfortable with the undercurrents of this particular deal. All the paperwork appears to be in order, he announced after reviewing the documents. Mr. Marcus Thompson, you're purchasing the property at 847 Maple Street for $75,000 cash. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Thompson. This sale will satisfy all outstanding liens against the property with a net proceeds of $3,200. The actual signing took less than 15 minutes. Papers were initialed, documents were notarized, and keys were exchanged. When it was finished, I was the legal owner of my childhood home, and my parents were effectively homeless. As we gathered our copies of the paperwork, Linda approached me hesitantly. "Marcus, we wanted you to know that we're moving to Cedar Falls. Robert found work at the lumber yard there, and I have a cleaning job lined up. We'll be renting a small apartment on Pine Street." I nodded politely. "That's good. Cedar Falls is a nice town." "The apartment is furnished," she continued, "so we had to leave some things behind, personal items mostly. Photo albums, some of your father's tools, Christmas decorations. If you don't want them, we understand, but—" "Leave them," I said. "I'll go through everything and decide what to keep." Robert, who had remained silent throughout the closing, finally spoke. "There's something in the basement workshop that belongs to you. A rocking chair I was making for your first apartment. I never finished it after you left." The mention of the unfinished chair hit me unexpectedly. I remembered Robert starting that project during my senior year, back when we'd still talked about my future plans without arguing. He'd been excited about the prospect of making something I could take with me to college. "I'll find it," I said quietly. That afternoon, I stood in the driveway of my new property, holding the keys that had been handed to me in a sterile conference room. The house looked exactly as it had when I was 18, except now it belonged to me. The boy who had been escorted out with a garbage bag was now the owner. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house felt larger than I remembered, perhaps because it was nearly empty. My parents had taken most of their furniture, leaving behind only the pieces too old or worn to justify moving. The living room contained a faded couch, a scratched coffee table, and the old television that had been ancient, even during my childhood. Walking through the rooms was like touring a museum of my former life. The kitchen still had the same cracked linoleum floor where I'd eaten countless bowls of cereal before school. The staircase still creaked on the third step. My old bedroom was completely empty except for marks on the wall where posters had once hung. In the basement, I found the workshop where Robert had spent countless hours on weekend projects. Most of his tools were gone, but in the corner sat the unfinished rocking chair, covered in a thin layer of dust. The seat had been sanded smooth, and the rockers were perfectly curved, but the back and armrests were only roughly shaped. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, abandoned mid-creation. I ran my fingers along the smooth wood, remembering the sound of Robert's sandpaper on Saturday mornings, the smell of wood stain, the pride in his voice when he'd shown me joinery techniques. For a moment, I could almost pretend that nothing had changed, that this was still home and we were still family. But the moment passed. I covered the chair with a tarp and went back upstairs. Over the next month, I transformed the house into a rental property. My crew and I replaced the roof, updated the electrical system, refinished the hardwood floors, and painted every room. The kitchen got new appliances and countertops. The bathrooms were completely renovated. By Thanksgiving, it barely resembled the house I'd grown up in. I found a tenant almost immediately, a young couple named the Washingtons, both teachers at the elementary school. They were excited about the renovated house and grateful for the reasonable rent I charged. Watching them move in their belongings, hanging pictures, and arranging furniture, I felt a strange satisfaction. The house would be a home again, just not mine. The rental income from the property, combined with my business profits, allowed me to make an offer on a larger house across town. It was a Victorian-era home that needed significant renovation, but it had good bones and unlimited potential. More importantly, it had no emotional baggage attached to it. As I worked on my new house, stripping wallpaper, refinishing original hardwood, updating plumbing, I often thought about the journey that had brought me here. The scared 18-year-old with a garbage bag had become a successful business owner with multiple properties. I had achieved everything I dreamed of and more. Yet success felt different than I'd expected. The satisfaction I'd imagined from proving my parents wrong was muted by the reality of what our relationship had become. We were strangers now, connected only by shared DNA and painful memories. 6 months after the closing, I received a Christmas card addressed in Linda's careful handwriting. Inside was a photo of my parents in their new apartment, standing beside a small Christmas tree. They looked older but peaceful, as if the stress of impending foreclosure had been replaced by the simple contentment of stable housing. On the back of the photo, Linda had written, "We're doing well in Cedar Falls. Robert likes his new job, and I've built up a good client base. We think about you often and hope you're happy. Love, Mom and Dad." I set the card on my kitchen counter, where it remained for weeks. Sometimes I'd glance at it while making coffee or preparing dinner, studying their faces for signs of regret or resentment. I found neither. They looked like people who had accepted their circumstances and were making the best of their new situation. The final piece of closure came the following spring. I was driving through Cedar Falls on business when I spotted Robert outside the lumberyard, loading materials into a customer's truck. He moved with the same methodical efficiency I remembered from my childhood, and he seemed genuinely engaged with his work. When he smiled at something the customer said, I realized I hadn't seen him smile in years. I didn't stop or try to talk to him. Instead, I drove home to my beautifully renovated Victorian house, where I spent the evening in my home office, reviewing financial statements and planning expansion strategies for my businesses. The numbers told the story of my success more clearly than any words could. Thompson Home Services now employed 23 people across 2 locations. I owned 4 rental properties and had a waiting list of potential tenants. My net worth at 23 exceeded what my parents had accumulated in their entire lives. I had proven that the son they'd kicked out could thrive without them. I had demonstrated that their lack of faith in my potential had been wrong. I had achieved every goal I'd set for myself in those desperate early days of independence. But as I sat in my comfortable office, surrounded by the trappings of success, I realized that the victory felt hollow. I had won a war that nobody else was fighting anymore. My parents had moved on, built a new life, and seemed genuinely content with their circumstances. The narrative of rejection and revenge that had driven me for 5 years was no longer relevant to their reality. They had let me go, and in doing so, they had freed themselves as well. The garbage bag that had once symbolized my humiliation now seemed like what it had always been, simply a way to carry belongings from one place to another. The keys to their house, which I'd thought would represent ultimate vindication, were just metal objects that opened doors to rooms that other people now called home. I had bought their house and changed the locks, just as I'd dreamed of doing during those bitter early months, but in the end, the only person who remained locked out was me. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.